Thanks everyone for having me. I planned for maybe about 40 minutes-ish potentially, and then, as I said, I want it to be a Q&A, so if there's anything that you want to ask about, not just this, but any educational base that you kind of want to know about, feel free to ask those questions towards the end as well. So in terms of an outline of what this session might be, I just want to go through some numbers and about kind of where it is that we might be going wrong in terms of reading, and I think just some core facts that I think teachers do need to know about the English language. We'll go through, I think there are 3 models of reading that I think I want all teachers to be aware of. We'll look at the importance of phonics, of fluency, comprehension for the secondary teachers here. I hope there are some with us. We're going to look at disciplinary literacy very quickly before looking at further reading and recommendations as well as to where you can get more information. I am very much standing on the shoulder of many giants delivering this, and so I'll kind of tell you who those giants are as we go through this process. So reading in numbers, where are we getting it wrong? As of 2015, it's kind of reported that only 1 in 5 children in England, they cannot read well by the age of 11, and they'll be using SATs data to get that results. That clearly is not good enough at all whatsoever. Again, in 2015, we're then talking about only 18% of children of 15-year-olds in England don't have the minimum level of literacy proficiency that they need. So clearly, the fact that there's this gap isn't narrowing down. It's cause for concern, because if they're leaving primary at 11, and by the age of 15, 4 years of secondary school, we've only managed to reduce that to 2%. There's still an issue going on that we need to address. By the final year of compulsory schooling in England, the reading skills of children from the disadvantaged backgrounds on average almost 3 years behind those from the most affluent homes. Plenty of reasons for that. Access to books, having those good role models of reading as a pastime at home tends not to happen. It's TV, lots of things happening here, but again, things that aren't going to help the most disadvantaged. We need to make sure that we provide them excellent models for what excellent reading is. And as I say, finding as much time in our schools for them to read as much as possible. 1 in 11 children and young people don't have their own book. And when you think about the disadvantage gap, that then reduces to just 1 in 8, according to the National Literacy Trust. So I'm in a very privileged position where I have plenty of educational books. I'm in the stage now where I buy more than I can actually get through. Imagine for 1 second that not being the case, where 1 in 8 may not actually have their own book to call their own. And then this final piece, that 25% of 15-year-olds have a reading age of under 12, and that was kind of relatively recent. That was in the GL assessment in 2020. So starting off, I think, with quite some shocking statistics and numbers, because I just really want to hit home how important reading is. And I'll be the first person to raise my hand and say, for the first kind of 2 or 3 years of me being a teacher, I definitely did not privilege reading as much as I should have done. So now we're going to look at some numbers about the English language and a bit of history of teaching of reading. So historically, there's kind of been 3 approaches to learning to decode. That's phonics, where we break it down to the smallest possible unit of sound. We teach those sounds. We teach children to blend and segment, put those sounds together so that they can read unknown words. There's what they call the whole word method, and that's traditionally was looking at a flashcard based, here are some words that we need them to learn, we'll just throw loads of flashcards at them until it kind of sinks in. Doesn't work for everyone, because we'll find out the way that the brain learns to read is not through these kind of visual techniques. It doesn't work. What will happen is that some children will learn that way, because what they'll be able to do is work out what the code is by themselves. However, it tends to be the more affluent who are able to do that, and not the disadvantaged. And then you have this idea of balanced literacy, which tries to combine both elements. However, The phonics approach is not particularly systematic. It might be every now and then a bit of phonics when it comes up, but it's definitely not a systematic approach to teaching reading. 26 letters in the alphabet, definitely something that I think everyone here will know. 44 sounds in the English language, got 25 consonant sounds and 19 vowel sounds. Really important when we're thinking about spelling. We think about vowel as sounds and not as those typical letters, as that's where confusion can rise for some children in spelling. 76 consonant blends, so that's how you put those consonants together to create a blend. So in a word like street, for example, you have the consonant blend of S, T, and R, so str. And what the issue with alphabetic languages is that it's really hard for children to hear those consonant blends. And that's what makes learning to read, one of the reasons learning to read in an alphabetical system really difficult to read, because our ears aren't particularly well tuned to actually pick up those consonant blends. And there's certainly been evidence of certain languages in India, for example, where they transitioned to an alphabetic approach, but realized it was so difficult for them to hear all these blends, they then transitioned back to some sort of syllabic method for their alphabet. This is quite a popular one. 90% of the words need to be known for the reader to have a good chance of understanding a text. There are only about 176 common spellings. So we have, from when children enter year R, so year reception at the age of 4, we are then given them, until the end of year 6 and beyond in secondary school, for them just to master what is effectively 44 sounds and 176 ways to spell. I think personally that is a very possible thing for all children to kind of do. Our average words accurate per minute that a good silent reader will read is approximately 250 to 300 words per minute, and that's with silent reading. When it's oral reading, it's slightly lower. 2,500 to 5,000, that's roughly the number of logographical images that can be held in our long-term memory at any one point. It can be more than that, but it requires such effort to expand beyond that you start to, when you do the cost benefit analysis, it tends not to be worth it. This is really important because this kind of goes to some way to explain why we can't sight read, that is to learn to read by looking at words as a whole and memorizing them as just kind of one meaningful string, because what you're effectively saying then is that we're going to cap the vocabulary to about 2,500 to 5,000 words. And as you can kind of see here, there are 55,000 legal syllables. So some languages, they use syllables to kind of say their languages. Kanji in Japan is quite a popular one for that, because they have so fewer syllables. They have just under 2,000, I believe. So it's well within those limits of what our long-term memory can actually hold. And this is important because the average vocabulary of a first language English speaker, depending on where you go, is roughly kind of 70,000. And so obviously that number is far larger than this, the number of logographical images that we can hold at any one point. And so what we're effectively saying is, if we want to say, oh, do you know what, we'll teach you to read sight words by sight, lots of flashcards. Effectively what we're saying is that we're going to cap your vocabulary to about 5,000 words. And for me, would be a horrific ethical position to put oneself in, to decide what 5,000 words those are. So there's some kind of reading in numbers. Here's, I think, there's some models that I'm sure people might be familiar with. This is what we call the simple view of reading by Goff and Tummer around in 1986, around quite a long time. And it kind of just helps us to see where children might be across kind of a spectrum. Here we can see that if you have a good language comprehension processes, good word recognition, you're going to be a good reader. If you have good language comprehension, but poor word reading, then this kind of tells us, right, okay, so their comprehension side is fine. They understand verbal commands, that's fine. They can read, they can understand the questions when the text has been read to them. So this tells us, right, we need to help them on their decoding. Here we look at their poor language comprehension and poor word recognition. So here there's going to be two kinds of interventions that are going to be needed. There might be some speech and language for the comprehension. It might be something to do with listening, and also they're going to need some decoding interventions as well. And as you'll find out, that's going to be phonics. Here is children who will have a good word recognition, but poor language comprehension. Very rarely do you see children like this, but it does happen. It can just be that although their word recognition processes is really good, it might be their fluency that lets them down. So they have made that mapping between the sounds and the letters, but what they haven't quite done is mastered it yet. So those might be one things that you want to do, but as well, you really want to make sure then that language comprehension is there as well. Really important to note that when we think about this model, it's not additive, it's multiplicative. So if you have a decoding of 0, but your language comprehension is worth 1, your reading comprehension still comes out as 0. Likewise, if you have decoding strategies and you're a very fluent decoder, but your language comprehension is 0, you're still going to come out as a 0 on your reading comprehension. What we want to do is make sure that as many children are in this kind of top right bracket as possible. But this is a useful framework just to kind of see, right, okay, well, I know when I talk to these children, they do understand it, but when I leave them to read independently, they don't. That tells me it's probably a word recognition process that's letting them down. And so it's a useful model just for targeting interventions. This other model that's really interesting is Scarborough's Reading Rope. This was released in 2001. It's now the 20-year anniversary. There's some great podcasts all about each of these strands. And what this model does is that it looks at what it takes to be a skilled reader, but at a bit more depth and detail than the simple view of reading does. It breaks down language comprehension pretty comprehensively. It looks at background knowledge, the importance of vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge, as well as that word recognition. And as children become more skilled, all these twines of the rope kind of wrap around each other, and so you get and produce skilled reading. It's a really useful model. I particularly do like it. One criticism that I do have, perhaps, is that all the different twines of the rope are kind of look like they're given equal weighting. For me personally, I think background knowledge would be a massively bigger piece of the puzzle than perhaps when you compared to language structures, though it is still important. It still needs to be there. When you think about the weighting of what instruction should be, it's not useful in terms of looking at that. And the final one is so they call it the general triangle framework, and it kind of explains how it is that we read, what channels that we use to make meaning from those words that are on the page. So it's whether we look at the spelling, the phonology, we use that to get meaning, and we kind of use the context as well to bring that across. So experienced readers, we can access word meaning not only through just the sounds, but we can now get there through the spelling, but we're still using the phonological channels to help us. What changes is the weighting that is used between each channel. When we're beginner readers and novice readers, we use a lot more cognitive efforts of the phonological channel. As we become more experienced, we use a lot more the spelling side of it, or the orthographic side of it can really kind of help us out here. So let's talk very briefly about phonics. As mentioned earlier, they have 44 sounds, 176 common spellings. Phonics just means that, the smallest unit of sound in language. Really important that children develop their phonological awareness, which is just their ability to pick out and understand these sounds, and can they actually hear them. So in phonics, can they hear f, m, I, k, s? because if they need to be able to hear those individual sounds to be able to then blend them, segment them, to say them themselves. And if they can't hear it, then developing their phonics knowledge becomes quite difficult. That's not to say that it's impossible for them to do. Of course they can. It's not to say that they then need to get to a certain level of their phonological awareness before they can start their phonics, because actually what the studies seem to suggest is that phonological awareness can develop at the same time as phonics instruction. But it's still something important to remember that, you know, it is, and this phonological awareness is heavily kind of in the audio, what we can actually hear. So we can't just kind of see a spelling and just read it straight away as novice readers. We have to really kind of break down each part into its sound. We need to understand what the code is. So do we know that in this case that a P and a H stands for the F sound? A common way to do it might be something like this, where we teach some simple code, in this case, S, A, T, P, I, N, and we might ask children to build a word and make a word. So we might say, you know, what sounds have I put down here? And we've got S, A, T, okay, and then can they blend it all together, and then sat. So that's when we talk about segmenting and blending. Segmenting is just kind of pulling those sounds apart. So if I say, here's the word sat, can you pull the sounds apart? You might have s, a, t is what you'd want children to do. Likewise, I might have, let's get rid of this. I got a and t. Can you now blend these sounds together, in which case you would expect them to say it as at. The interesting thing though is when we think about the skills versus the tasks involved for these kinds of things. To blend, there is only kind of one task that you can do, and that is to blend it. So if this is sat, you need to be able to say sat. When it comes to segmenting though, the actual skill of being able to pull these sounds apart incredibly quickly and manipulate the phonemes doesn't necessarily correlate with just the skill of being able to go s, a, t. And a way to think about this would be to, if I asked people in the audience, if I wanted to change sat to pat, what sound would change? What you're doing then by doing something like that is that I'm sure we've all got to the point where our phonemic awareness and our phonological awareness is expert, is that you can do that pretty quickly. But what you're doing by that is doing 4 kind of phonological awareness tasks. You're able to segment the word sat into its 3 corresponding sounds. You're able to isolate what that s is. You're then able to manipulate it and say, right, I can take that out because that's the sound that needs to change, because sat and pat sounds different. There's some that are the same. And actually I need p, and I know that this symbol here represents my p. But that's only at the start. That's the starting sound. And the starting sound is always the easiest to hear. Then it's always the sound that comes towards the end, and then it's the sound that comes towards, that's in the middle. So I might say now, can we change pat to pan? Pat, pan. So I know that the T, so again, I've segmented it, I've isolated it, I'm manipulating it, pan, and I'm putting it back together. Now I might say, can we change pan to pin? In this case, pan, pin, okay. This comes out. And they're actually doing activities like this, which aren't present in many phonics programs with the actual skill needed to actually blend everything back together, than actually just kind of looking at those skills in isolation, or just going, oh, this is p, it. So any Key Stage 1 folks out there, definitely think about incorporating activities like this within your phonics provision, because research seems to suggest that those are kind of activities help a lot more developing phonological awareness, but also really kind of help develop that skill of segmenting. And so bringing it back to here, what happens is that we start off with that phonology. We go that s, at, we need that, we relate that to the meaning, to the spelling. And through those channels, then we can kind of create that meaning together. Novice readers still be using a lot of that phonology. I can't speak today, phonology. However, eventually the spelling can become the more dominant channel that happens. But it's really important that we never actually bypass that phonological channel. We're always still using it, but when we become more expert, the spelling can take over. And this was kind of demonstrated in some experiments. They call it the Van Olden experiment in the 1980s, which is when sight words and learning through a whole word was kind of quite popular. So I'm just going to kind of go through this experiment quite quickly. So I'm going to show you a category, and then there'll be a target word that might relate to that category, and you need to decide whether it does. So my category is a body part. My target word is, and you need to decide whether it belongs to that category or not. Okay, so I think on that last one, I think something quite interesting possibly happened. If reading was only visual, the reaction time for bear would have been the same as all the others. But what probably happened is because the bear and bear are homophones of each other, what probably happened is that you took a little stumble, you thought maybe yes, maybe no, depending on how quick your reactions were. But you probably then realized, oh no, that was a mistake. That was, I made an error there. And so what happens there is that our semantics and the meaning is catching up then with the spelling and the phonology side of it. So the fact that it took a bit longer, it really implies that phonology was used to enact its semantic meaning. You had to stop yourself from saying yes. If you had said yes, it was incorrect, and that kind of shows that it can't just be this visual only representation, because otherwise we'd be able to match it straight away, and those reaction times would be as quick as all the previous ones. The next part, which does kind of get forgotten about in the reading kind of process, is this idea of fluency. Fluency, as I say, is this idea, this bridge between word recognition and comprehension. It involves thinking about the accuracy, the automaticity, and the prosody. So does it sound like natural speech? So it's not enough that readers read a whole word in a text accurately. We need to be able to do that automatically. At the end of year 2, so that's 6 and 7-year-olds, we're looking at an idea of accuracy and automaticity of about 90 words per minute. Anything under that tends to very much limit comprehension. And so if you're faced with children like that, the last thing those children need is to be, given extra instruction in kind of comprehension. What they need to do is practice reading fluently, and there's some really very solid research ways in which we can actually do this, which I'll go into in a minute. Obviously, we want to make sure that all of those texts are age equivalent, that there's all nothing too strenuous or arduous in there. But I think for many readers, it's this idea, this is where this orthographic mapping helps to come in. So this idea that you can see the words on the page and you can attach those sounds to them immediately, and your orthographic mapping kind of helps cement that process all together, and that will then help you to develop this fluency and understand what it is that we need to be able to do to get these children to that next level. It's not more comprehension. It's actually, we need to do lots of reading. We need to do lots of reading together. I need to model what good reading is. And then you need to have the opportunities to try and mimic the way that I have read this text. So one way that you can kind of see here how prosody, which is where we put these kind of small intonations, how it can really kind of change the meaning of a sentence depending on where we choose to put those intonations. So here you can see lots of examples where Robert is stressed. We're stressing it's that particular individual. Where borrowed has been stressed, we're stressing the fact that it really was borrowed, it wasn't stolen. If we're emphasizing the my, it's not your bike, it's not someone else's bike, but emphasizing the fact that it was my bike that was, and all of these things can have real minute changes to how those sentences are perceived. And so getting children to read with prosody correctly in the way that the author intended is a massive way to kind of, to say, bridge that gap between word recognition and comprehension as well. In terms of what this might look like, thankfully, more useful perhaps for primary, but these are Americans. So grade 6 would be year 7 for secondary school teachers. In 2017, Hasbrook and Tyndall, they compiled plenty of research around what the average words correct per minute is, depending on where you are in your percentile. So here you can see that someone in year 6 would be year 7, who is in the top 25 percentile. When they started in September, they had oral words correct of 159 words. By the spring, that got to 173. For the top 10%, you had 185 words correct per minute. By the spring then, or our summer, that had moved to 204. So this is quite a useful frame of reference if you're thinking, well, where are my children in my class? This is just kind of a useful frame of reference to have. In terms of what this might look like in the classroom, research is pretty confident that repeated oral reading is the main crux of how we can really kind of get children to read more fluently. This normally involves 3 to 4 reads of one piece of text, normally about between 2 minutes maximum, at what would be just at the point where they would find it difficult to do it independently. It needs to have an expert reader modeling it. That might be you. It could be, if you know you have children who aren't very fluent, you could get them to do it. Or because we're all well versed in iPads now or other recording equipment, we could also record ourselves doing this. Really important that we give those children feedback. And it's paired reading. So I would model it once. Partner A would then get a chance to read to partner B. Partner B would provide feedback. They then swap roles. And what's really interesting coming out of the literature is this idea of goal setting. So we really want to tell them, we are doing this not because we just want to read repeatedly again and again, but actually it's to improve our fluency, or so that we really understand what's going on and what's happening. And what's really important when we kind of go to improve our fluency is that we don't just say, oh, I want you to hear, I'm going to put a minute on the board and you need to read as many words as you can in that minute, because then that takes away from the comprehension, it takes away from the meaning, and it becomes an arbitrary task. What's important is the fluency. Are they doing it automatically? Are they doing it with prosody? And are they accurate in the way that they do it? Right. Comprehension. I'm thinking you ask lots of people what comprehension is, I'm a big fan of simultaneously extracting and constructing meaning through interactions and involvement with written language. So I think comprehending includes those instances when the reader must obtain, they've got to extract that message that's been coded explicitly into text. That will require, inferencing, interpretation, connecting things together, and other actions that allow the construction of the message based on the partial or imperfect cues that the author has put into the text. So I kind of like this idea that it kind of brings the text to light, but it also brings the reader, and it's kind of the processes between those two things. And that helps us understand that, if I'm bringing a different text to different readers, it's all going to be different. If I'm going to bring a different, if I'm going to bring the same text but different readers, then I'm preparing myself for multiple interpretations of what's happening on here. I just want to kind of go through a few of these areas and look at how we can really kind of tackle comprehension, what I think would be in a far more effective way. So this construction integration model is something by Kitch in 2010. And this is where the reader has to kind of translate a text base. So that's whatever the writer has written into this kind of what they call a situational model, which is a non-verbal mental representation in the reader's mind of what they are extracting from off that page. What's important is that this happens kind of always during the process. It's not kind of something that happens right at the end, and we constantly update this situational model depending on new information that we think is important, but also on information that we no longer think is important. It's one of the reasons why we never remember exactly what we've just read, but we kind of create this model of what is, and we kind of take out what we don't think is important. We keep what is important. But to make these situational models, you obviously need to have a really deep understanding of what you are reading. So here is an example. Here's the first two sentences of some work that I'll be doing with some year threes later on. It rained hard, the ogre stood at the top of the tall cliffs. They need to have an understanding of what it means to actually rain hard compared to rain soft. They need to have a good idea of what this ogre is and what kind of their visual representation of that ogre is that I want them to bring will be very different to what I think they actually will bring. And this idea of he stood at the top, so they understand top and bottom, and tall cliffs. So again, there's some geographical vocabulary there as well. And so what we kind of end up seeing with, I think we do have it there. And so there was meant to be a picture of Shrek there, because what children's probably mental representations of that ogre would be Shrek, whereas actually I had a very different idea what I wanted that representation to be. And so because this happens in the moment, it's really important that we kind of teach this idea of comprehension monitoring, which is this idea that we need to teach children that actually, do you know what, sometimes it isn't going to make sense, and that's at a point where you need to stop and say, oh yeah, that didn't make sense, so I need to go back, I need to reread over it, I need to look at what didn't make sense and find out why that is, not just carry on reading. Because the issue that you'll have is if you're doing read the text and then answer all the questions, is that if that situational model is wrong within the first sentence or two, then by the time they're answering that first or second question and they've read the rest of the text, that situational model will be all over the place and they're really going to struggle. So this idea of read all the text, then answer the questions, it really is not a massively efficient way to read, to do comprehension, because it really does make it that much more difficult. And then here's this kind of other example as well, to kind of show this. It rained hard. The ogre stood at the top of the tall cliffs that touched the blue skies. So in my situational model, that can't make sense, because if it's raining, I'm associating that with dark grey clouds. So the fact that this tall cliff is touching the blue sky, it doesn't make sense. There's that, there's that friction there. So we need to teach children, right, where's the mistake in this? Why can't this be right? And the more we do this, hopefully then the more they'll transfer that into their own understanding. So this idea of a situational model, it happens while we read, really important. And because of this, we need to teach this idea of comprehension monitoring. When it comes to vocabulary, I'm sure people are very familiar with the ideas of Beck and McCohen, this idea of tiered vocabulary. So tier 1 are these everyday words. Then we got tier 2, which is this high utility of academic language. And then we kind of have this subject specific language. Lots have been written about this, but the idea is that our focus should be on this high utility academic language. If we need to get children to, if they need at least the words in a text, they need to understand, this is where our focus should be. So when we think about, oh, what words do we need to teach? Then it is these words. Thankfully, Avril Coxhead, she's produced this resource called the Academic Word List. Here they are listed in alphabetical order. This is a free resource. You can Google it and it will come up. This gives you a good idea as to what kind of words might be in that word list. I think she's got about 520 of them. So you can obviously think about how you might want to map those into a curriculum to make sure that children are kind of picking up all of those, particularly I think in secondary school, but I think from maybe perhaps year 4, year 5 onwards, these are words that we can start thinking about, well, how can we ensure that these words appear in our curriculum as well? The next, when it comes to vocabulary and vocabulary instruction, we can look at morphology, so suffixes and prefixes and roots. If we understand what these do and how they amend and change these root words, then again, we don't have to teach so many words altogether. We can actually just teach the root word. We can teach several suffixes and prefixes, and then children are able to put those together to create brand new words that they need, that they can then use. And this can kind of look something like these word matrices, where we have our root word of joy, we have various prefixes, different suffixes that we can add up. So you can have enjoyable, enjoyed, enjoying, overjoyed, over enjoying, etc., etc. So you can really kind of dilute, I suppose, the amount of words that we can actually need to teach, because obviously it'd be impossible for us to teach children all the words that they need. And then finally, something that I kind of think is particularly fascinating for me is this idea of etymology. Because of the history of England, we have kind of many root words that have Latin or kind of Greek root words. And so by teaching children what these roots, what these Greek roots might mean, it opens up other words as to what they might mean. And so actually they can, once they've read them, they've encoded them, that's orthographic mapping. Those words then become sight words. They at least have an awareness of these words so that they can actually use them as well. So an example of that might be geology. If we're teaching them that ology is the study of, and they know that G or geo is earth, then quite quickly children go, okay, well, this is an ology. I know that I've seen geo before in geothermal, so this must be something to do with the earth, and I know ology is study of, so this is going to be geology, the study of earth and then the processes. A nice way that you can kind of do this in the classroom that I've kind of been experimenting with is using these kind of little diagrams here. We have a root word. I might see if they know what the meaning, what derived words do they have. They can draw something, and then they can have an opportunity then to kind of use these in sentences as well. So this is a fun little activity, 5 minutes at the beginning of a reading lesson or at the beginning of an English lesson, depending on what your focus has been. And then you already have this idea, and this is something I don't see talked about too much, is this idea of vocabulary depth versus breadth. Very quickly, I think educators can get this idea of, teaching more, teaching more, teaching more. But I think sometimes, and certainly research is starting to show that comprehension is particularly dependent on vocabulary knowledge at levels of depth, not just necessarily by using lots and lots of words. So here's a kind of a nice idea of how you can get to, and how you can get to understand how well a children actually understand the words that they're using. This idea of either at level 1, where they've just heard of it, all the way through to level 6, can they give this theoretical definition of the word? And obviously, the lower down they go, the greater they understand that word, the more useful that word is to them, and so the more the greater meaning they can extract from that word. How am I doing? 20 minutes. We then need to look at this idea of comprehension strategies and skills. I am very much of the train of thought that comprehension is not a skills-based endeavor. This is a red timetable that you might see in any kind of primary school for reading, where they've dedicated, every Monday is just going to work on vocabulary. And then Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday this week, we're just going to focus on this inference skill. Friday is just going to be this prediction skill, etc., 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 etc. The issue that we have is that these skills, they refer to abilities to answer questions and different kind of comprehension types. Actually, they don't help us much in terms of actually comprehending what we're actually reading. The way that these things come about is that the reading domains tend to be taken from the end of Key Stage 2 SATs, and then these are just planted out from about year 3 onwards, in the hope that this will improve their comprehension. Whereas what you're really doing is just giving children from year 3 SAT practice effectively from the day from that moment onwards, and it's not effective. Certainly, there is no studies that show that teaching this way leads to higher comprehension. There has been research in different question types, but there are so many variables that affect those results. It's kind of impossible to work out what they mean. So they tend to not look at whether they were good readers or poor readers, whether they had low knowledge or high knowledge about the information, whether it was a story or an information text. So all of these kind of issues that kind of in the research means that we can't actually know whether this is effective or not. And because that situational model is built up during the process of reading, as I said, if your situational model has failed by that first paragraph, reading, answering these questions isn't going to help improve that comprehension, because your comprehension has been lost already. For me, it is not the best use of time that we could use to actually improve children's comprehension. What we can do, though, is look at this idea of comprehension strategies. Now, comprehension strategies includes things like monitoring, which we mentioned earlier. So this idea, you teach children to be metacognitive about their comprehension. Are they understanding that what they've read makes sense or doesn't make sense? Compared to skills, though, strategies have a far more substantial body of research behind it. The basic premise of these strategies is that readers need to actually think about the ideas in the texts that they're going to understand. And since they determine how to text choices involved are, these strategies kind of tie up to this metacognitive idea thinking. So they can go, okay, well, I need to see now, does this work now? Is this working now? Okay, I can see how these relate to each other. So you have summarization. Now, also what's important here is that it's not the act of summarization that is going to improve the comprehension. Because if they don't understand it, then they won't summarize it correctly. But these are things that just kind of helps keep children on track, especially when we're going to extended reads, kind of helps children to remember what's happened before. So summarization. So are we, after a paragraph, are we asking children, say, oh, can we summarize what's happened in here? A couple of words, 240 characters if you want to bring in those activities that I've seen a few on Twitter quite recently. Self-questioning. Oh, so why did the character do this? Or where is he now? We want to build up those kinds of things. This idea of visualization. So, many children actually don't understand that that comprehension is actually about visualizing it and understanding that you are playing these movies in your head. And then obviously you want to activate prior knowledge where possible, but again, you always need to be careful, because that's where mark schemes come and stop you from kind of being too elaborate in how much prior knowledge you bring to it. I remember that there are some in SATs paper mark schemes, you know, they are very explicit in saying if they've used their own prior knowledge, then they can't get the answer because it hasn't derived from the text. But that doesn't mean that we can't use our prior knowledge to help understand what the text is saying. The way that we can teach these is through this kind of ability. So we might be doing a lot of the work to begin with, and then we then gradually get the children to do more and more of it. And these are things that you can start, I think, from about year 3, year 4. And again, they need to become intentional actions on part of the children. So once you've taught it once, it's not something that you then kind of forget about, but you're on the way out. Oh, okay, I am now going to choose to summarize. I'm now going to choose to self-question because I'm not sure about something. And it's all about then making those correctives afterwards. Okay, so if I've not summarized this effectively, or I can't answer this question yet, I'm going to go back. I'm going to reread. I'm going to see, you know, did I miss something? It might be the case, oh, I accidentally skipped, you know, a page whilst turning over. It might be something as simple as that, but we need to teach these things to the children. These aren't the main focus of the lessons either. These are just additional things to say, okay, well, here's something interesting that can help us with our comprehension. But the main focus is very much so of a lesson, but in my opinion, is to, right, let's learn something from this text that we are looking at right now. In terms of how long this happens, the research is not particularly conclusive. What we do know is that it's probably a bit longer than 6 weeks, but it's certainly not 3 years worth, which is kind of the model that you get here, where it's just, all right, Monday, we're going to do vocabulary. On Tuesday and Wednesday, we're going to do inference. It's not going to work that way. It's certainly not worth 3 years of time. I would say, personally, I would think spaced out across a year, I would probably say about 9 weeks of instruction on this is probably more than enough, but that is just a hunch. Once you've done it once, just drip it in, drip it in, drip it in, so that you're always referring back to it. I wanted to spend a bit of time on inference in particular, because this is something that, certainly in primary school, something that irritates me massively is when we get children to do SATs tests for assessments, even though, you know, we really shouldn't be doing SATs papers for assessments, because they're trying to assess so many different things that actually there's so much noise in those assessments that they tend to be pretty much useless. But what tends to happen at primary, if you're not familiar, is that teachers are asked to do this. They will then have a question level analysis sheet, which kind of has each question by domain. And then if they get it right, it'll go green. If they get it wrong, it will go red. What tends to happen is that all the inference questions, there's usually a big chunk of pupils that come up red. And so what happens is that those children are taken out of a lesson and they're given inference, and air quotes there, inference practice. The problem is that inference is not a generic skill. Cards like this, very quickly I found on the internet, are not going to help children get better at inference in an unseen text. It's just not going to happen. What's going to be important is that how much knowledge they understand about the topic that they're going to be reading. There are some inferences that are kind of important that I think teachers do need to know, and that's this kind of local cohesive inference. And this clarifies the meaning of words and phrases by linking them within the text, kind of only within a sentence or two. So here you got the turtle sat on a log, a fish swam under it. When we're thinking about local cohesive inferences, you need to think about, well, what is it referring to? Because, you know, that's something that we don't necessarily teach as an inference skill, but it is an inference to make. We need to make the inference that it is referring back to this kind of log that might be floating on the water that the turtle is sat on. Then you have this global inference where you connect different parts of a text by linking them with kind of these bigger mental models of the text. So the children looked around the exhibition. When the alarm went off, they quickly found their teacher, who led them to safety. So a global inference in this kind of text might be, well, where are these children? The fact that they're in an exhibition, it might suggest, they're at some kind of museum or something like that. Then you have elaborative inferences, where they link very much to global inferences, where perhaps it's either not necessary, as it doesn't change the meaning of the text drastically, or this is what we call it when those children go so far off field that it kind of bears no resemblance to what's actually happening in the text. So in this example, if we're saying they're in a museum, the fact that they're in a museum is more important than saying, well, okay, I think they're in the Science Museum or the Natural History Museum or the V&A, because right now I don't know enough information about that. The fact that they're trying to guess which museum is a elaborative inference. So those are kind of three different inferences that I think are important for teachers to know, because I certainly, when it came to the local cohesive, I certainly kind of brushed over those small little pieces quite often, where actually I think since I've been aware of it and I've been asking children, oh, what does it mean there? Or who's them when it says that, when it says that in the sentence, the amount of children actually tricking up on that surprised me. And it's something that I kind of, talk about curse of knowledge. It's something that I really kind of took for granted. And kind of linked to this is this idea of language structures. So cohesive ties are kind of anaphor, and it kind of helps tie sentences within a text together. So if we're looking at this example again, the children looked around the exhibition. When the alarm went off, they quickly found their teacher who led them to safety. So here, kind of this idea of they and them and these anaphor, do children, when they read text like this, can they relate it back to who the they and the them, are referring to? Are they sure that the they and the them here refer back to those children? You then have lexical cohesions, and these are kind of different anaphoric links, and they're kind of all about kind of these definite nouns and how we can use, we're not maybe so specific in what we say in one noun, and then another noun goes into a bit more detail. So you can see here, they took apart some picnic supplies. The cider was warm. Children need to understand that the cider was referring to some of those picnic supplies. The boy asked for some orange juice. His sister handed him the bottle. They need to understand this idea of item and container. So they wanted the item that was orange juice. They need to understand, well, these things come in containers. So when the next sentence refers to the bottle, it's linking back to the orange juice. Here we got this idea of item and broader category. So they were thirsty and they ordered 2 large lagers. Luckily, the drinks were served immediately. This idea, understanding that the drinks is referring to the lagers. I've just noticed that it's Tuesday and there's a big kind of alcohol theme running through this. And then obviously synonyms. Glenn had a pile of jumpers in the chest of drawers. On Sundays, he always chose the blue and stripy pullover. Pullover is a synonym of jumper. So if they don't understand those links, then comprehension might fall down there. The situational model might start to fall apart. And then we have connectives as well. Something, again, we teach children to use connectives in their writing, but we never really probably check to see whether they actually really do understand what each connective means and the impact that can have on the comprehension of the piece. There's some examples there. So June left the barbecue early just before Bill arrived. Excuse me, June left the barbecue early after Bill arrived. June left the barbecue early at the very moment Bill arrived. So 3 different kind of connectives to join the 2 different clauses together. However, they changed that situational model completely differently. And so that's kind of a massive, I guess, theme that I want to pull out in here, is that these minute little things that perhaps we might take for granted might be one reason why children struggle in their comprehension. Literacy knowledge is also another one where part of the reading rope that we use to kind of help us with our comprehension. There are two kind of broad text genres, this idea of narrative and informational or expository texts. And our knowledge of these different text types that we bring to the table when we're reading something can help us with our comprehension. So readers who are particularly familiar with structures of the genre of a text, they have several advantages. They know what to expect from different parts of the text. They might know where to search for particular types of information or how the different types of information are linked together. They'll understand that narratives concern about characters, their actions, their emotions, their interactions with other characters in the text and the physical world, and that narratives kind of have, they come together to bring a point of view. So children who are coming with those ideas of a narrative are likely to be able to make sense of other narratives. Whereas, expository texts, they can follow a range of structures such as description, sequence, compare and contrast, cause and effect, problem and solution. And so if children understand and they have an understanding of those kind of deep level surface, those deep structures of texts, they use that and they bring that to kind of help them understand when they see texts like that before. Quite an interesting thing is this idea that actually graphic organizers are particularly helpful in doing that, to find those structures of those texts. Not that I'm sure David has any more work to do, but if he ever wants to think about doing a comprehension guide to graphic organizers, I would love for that to happen. And so actually teaching children to match to graphic organizers to certain different types of, in this case, expository texts, can help improve that comprehension and what's going on. So I'm a bit short for time, so this would be, if you a quick task, but there are 4 graphic organizers here, and obviously there are 5 different text types there for expository text. Which one best which graphic organizer would you use if you want to kind of extrapolate the deep structure of that particular type of expository text? I'll send all these slides to Louise, and she can kind of send them out afterwards. So if you want to give that a go, feel free to, absolutely. The last thing I want to kind of look at is this idea of disciplinary literacy. This more geared towards the secondary side of things, but I think there's room for it in upper key stage 2. As it kind of suggests, it's looking at actually how in the disciplines, literacy is important but can differ. So I know there might be some secondary teachers here who are who might remember when you had whole school literacy policies and things like that, and they were normally quite generic. This definitely kind of steps away from that and really kind of champions the disciplines of those literacy of the different within the different subjects. Everything that I'm going to come to has kind of been paraphrased from this. It is free if you Google it, and it's one of the best chapters on disciplinary literacy in terms of its accessibility that I've kind of been able to find. What's important to note is that disciplinary literacy kind of promotes the idea of reading and writing like experts in their field, and kind of the content areas of reading tries to develop a useful set of study techniques. So it's kind of quite different to this kind of idea of generic literacy. It's more about what do experts in your field do. So you might have, we'll look very briefly at 3 subjects. We'll look at what happens at the text level and what happens at the reading level. And again, I'm paraphrasing what I've read. I'm aware that there might be secondary school teachers here, so absolutely your expertise, you might say that I'm wrong, and I'll put my hand up and say that I more than likely am. So when we look at science, we look at what the text is like. The nature of scientific text kind of mirrors the nature of scientific inquiry. When they write about their observations, and they go through that processes, what tends to happen is that those kind of readers, the texts, the language structures kind of use everything that they go through by going through that inquiry. So they will have make sure that there's, you know, scientific notations, there'll be multimodality, there'll be diagrams where needed, they'll show processes, they'll have that objectivity. In history, they're going to be using various interpretive lenses, depending on what they're looking for. They obviously draw on a wide range of different text types, depending on what they're choosing to, in what they're inquiring about at the actual time. And obviously they are going to, you know, what they want to make sure what they're having is from credible, sorry, I can't get words out. What they want to make sure is that they are deemed, what they look at is deemed kind of credible. So they look at it through this kind of evaluative, critical lens. Whereas, of course, literature focuses more on the moral, philosophical content about the human experience. It's all about kind of that imagery, symbolism, irony, satire, rhetorical structures that that authors will use to kind of bring about certain points. When it comes into reading, though, it's the knowledge of the content. They'll look at promising lines of research and research methodology. So those are kind of some broader knowledge that people are bringing in. What tends to happen is that scientists, they'll evaluate the multimodal information, so they'll make sure those diagrams are accurate. And quite interestingly is that scientists don't tend to read linearly, so they might look at a certain piece, they might look at the results first, and then look at the method, before then going back, perhaps looking at the starts and looking at the abstract or whatever it might be. Historians, they read in ways that are consistent with how knowledge is created and communicated in the discipline. So what they will tend to do is that they read with a lens of where is it sourced and how is it that particular bit of reading sourced. They'll contextualize it, so how it fits into their wider inquiry. And obviously they'll look at it through a corroborated lens. So is what's matching in text A matching up with what they've read elsewhere in text B or in text C, whatever it is that might do. And in kind of literature, experts, they draw on their knowledge of the whole field about how the field kind of creates and communicates and evaluates literature. What they tend to do, and what I was always very bad at, is that they can extrapolate kind of greater meaning from the text. So they can see past the surface level and they get to that really kind of deep level of understanding of how it is that they, or what it is that the author is trying to communicate. And they know what the approaches are needed to get meaning from them. So they don't kind of tie themselves down to the surface area, they can, or the surface level. So when they make comments about literature, it tends not to be in the content, in the context of what they're reading, but it's kind of a wider purpose of it, if that makes sense. Things that teachers can do, and all of these things will help comprehension. Obviously, make sure these texts are available, make sure that you read them, link this reading and writing to inquiry work, explicit instruction in these features and formats, explicit instruction in kind of the strategies that we've kind of talked about, teaching the discipline, which I think there's been a far more greater focus on now. And obviously what we're doing now as well is developing these rich content knowledges in the disciplines. In terms of where you can go and read more, Mark Seidenberg's Language at the Speed of Sight is an excellent text to understand how it is that we read at a cognitive level on the brain. Again, this one for secondary colleagues, excellent chapters in here about vocabulary as well as disciplinary knowledge, disciplinary literacy, understanding, teaching, reading comprehension, kind of really looking at those minute ideas, those anaphor, cohesive, those connectives and how those are important to understanding comprehension. The art and science of teaching primary reading, really good stuff in there. And Chris does an excellent job of kind of bringing all the research together, but then kind of really producing what this might look like in the classroom. Well worth a buy, I'm sure. I think it comes out, it's available to pre-order now, out in August. And in the Research Ed Guide to Leadership, the Reading Ape has an excellent chapter on what it means to lead reading in there as well. So definitely some worthwhile recommendations. I appreciate that's been me for just over an hour, so thank you very much. Love to hear any questions that you have on anything like that. So I'll pass back over to Louise.
I think you're going to have to pass back over to me. I'm not too
still
sure.
here.
Oh, you're still here?
Yeah, only because what Neil was saying at the end there. So I just thought I'm doing two jobs at once, Neil. I'm hosting a Twitter chat while I'm on here. So, but yeah, I just wanted to discuss a couple of bits from the end there.
So are you going to be working with Neil then as well?
Well, one of the things that's interesting, Neil, is in our upcoming book, for each of the 4 types of graphic organisers. So I think your slides presented it as, if you go to the slide after that, Neil, I think it was on, so description, which we have as chunks. So Oliver's established 4 types. So we have chunk, compare and contrast, sequence, cause and effect. And what's interesting is for the start of each of those sections in our book, we have a list of key vocabulary that would signal which graphic organizer to use in the for the text that you want to represent, or for the activity that you're working on. So it's really reassuring though to see that these different text structures and text types are so. There's very few texts that won't fit into one of these 4 categories. I think you've got problem and solution there, haven't you, at the bottom, which we sort of have subsumed under cause and effect anyway. But yeah, it's really it's reassuring to see. Have you seen the darts program, Neil? Ed Lunzer from I think like the 1980s.
I have not, no.
Which again, it's got this exposing people to these different text types, and activities are very similar to this, where when students are made more aware of what the structure of the text is, they can make better sense of it and make meaning from it. So yeah, we've got some of that in the book, which is it's reassuring. Great to see you speaking about it as well, because it's one of my. When people ask me how I got interested in using graphic organisers and things like that, one of my first answers is to help students make better sense of what they're reading.
Yeah.
Which always surprises people, but I think, if you can help bypass the complexities of syntax and that sort of stuff, it's, why not? Brilliant. Anyway, I'm going to mute myself. I'll hand back to you, Neil. I'm going to try and catch up with all these tweets that I've just missed from this chat that I'm supposed to be hosting.
Good luck. It's mental.
Sorry, Lou.
Right, I've got some questions for you, Neil. So Elliot has asked, in your opinion, why is whole class reading superior to carousel?
Why is whole class reading superior to carousel? Again, I don't know how many secondary teachers I have, so just very quickly, carousel reading is very much where the teacher will read with a set of students, and as the name suggests, carousel, the groups will rotate. Whilst that group is reading with the teacher, there will be some I'll call them holding activities, which basically means what can I give the other children to do whilst I'm really focusing on these children that I'm that I want to read with and get to discuss a text with. And so it comes down to, do you really want to just hear those children read? So that means you'll probably hear a whole class once a week if you're lucky. Or with whole class reading, there are things that you can do to ensure that you get everyone reading a lot more. It also means that effectively we're not wasting half an hour of the kids' time by giving them banal activities that really make no discernible difference to their understanding of text or of comprehension. But it's basically, what can we give them for half an hour that means that I can keep them busy? And I think the time is far better used to ensure that we can, participate in whole class discussions. It means that children will hear age appropriate text. So that might mean that, children might still have struggle with decoding ever so slightly. But certainly there's no, if they're still, at the lower levels of decoding, yes, they'll need decodables or phonetically controlled books. But certainly once they're starting to master it, the research is very iffy on when we stop decodable books and when we go into what I would, age appropriate books. And certainly what the research seems to suggest is once students have mastered some decoding, it's far more beneficial for those children to continue on what would be age appropriate or year group appropriate texts. And so actually what you ensure is that those children then have access to those texts. And because if you were doing a fluency model, for example, where you want to improve their fluency, actually, they are reading text 3 or 4 times that's just above their level, which means they're going to get a lot more out of that than just them going through some simpler book that isn't actually going to build their knowledge of understanding of the world or things like that. So I just think and it's less work on the teacher. Otherwise, you have to plan them those 4 or 5 activities and rotate them. Whole class reading is very simply just right, we're going to read this. These are the questions that I'm going to ask. This is the paragraph I want partner A to read to partner B. This is the paragraph I want partner B to read, or it's easier as well. So it's a workload win, and it's a win for all the students as well.
Okay, thank you. Emma's asked, when constructing comprehension text-dependent questions for literature, is there a particular process that you go through, or do you write questions purely to help pupils to establish the meaning of the text, including the best range of question sequences at the right depth is quite challenging? So
for me, again, depending on what the kind of text is, it is very much understanding the text. I am not particularly interested personally at Viper reading domain style questions at this point. All I want to do is make sure that because that might be the fact that if I'm reading a non-fiction, I know they don't have enough background knowledge to make an inference about this yet. So I'm not going to ask those questions. So I very much use what I know and what my assessment tells me what the children know about. Obviously, if it's something that I think, once we're into a book a little bit more, then I will probably ask a few more inference style questions to see if they're making those connections, between what's happened now in the text compared to what's happened, before in the text. That those global inferences, certainly, but all the time, again, I'm asking those local inferences as well. Who is it referring to? They, them, all of those pronouns and things like that. So it's very much depending on those children that I have in front of me, but kind of my core purpose, my core kind of aim is, right, what do I need to ask to make sure those children come away with that situational model that I have of that text? And so that's certainly how I plan my questions, and it's always in the moment as well. So we'll read a bit and I'll plan the question. When I've finished this sentence, then I'll ask my question. It's never left right until the end.
Cool. I've got one from Corey. He said, any recommendations for how you feel best bridges phonics with the reading curriculum across the primary phase?
Can you repeat that first bit again? Sorry.
Yeah, it says recommendations for how you feel best bridges phonics with the reading. I presume it just must be like, how would you work it together?
Yeah. So obviously there will come a point in your phonics program with decodables where children have learned all the grapheme phoneme correspondences that they need to. So I know that there's certainly in some of the work that the English hubs do, once children have read those decodable books, what they will then do is spend some time doing some fluency with them. So actually it's right, okay, so you know what those sound correspondences are. So, and this might be about, a year 2, perhaps, end of year 1, beginning of year 2, perhaps, where it's very much so, right, so they've read it once, where they're focusing on the phonology and mapping the graphemes and phonemes together. Then they'll do another session where they read the same book, but this time it's to read it like an expert reader, which, you can jazz up for year 1 and year 2 quite easily. And again, you can still go through those points of asking those questions as you do that, but the main focus is the reading fluently. I think at that level as well, what's really important is that when we talk about comprehension, we're talking about language comprehension, and language comprehension is a good indicator of reading comprehension. So it doesn't necessarily, at that age, it doesn't need to be the children doing all the decoding. You might want to do a read aloud. So I know the Core Knowledge website has some great books for year 1, year 2, English for English language arts. So things like, fables, and they've got, beautifully illustrated pictures that can go on the board for the children to see them, and a text for the teacher to read out as well. As long as the teacher's reading and the teacher is asking those questions and the children are, getting those answers right, that is still going to help in their reading. So it's also understanding when it comes to reading, to use Daisy Christodoulou's analogy of the marathon, the marathon is the end point. The training up to that might look substantially different at some points. And so I think for year 1, year 2, in that transition from kind of phonics through to more independent reading, making it a far more discussion based, where the teacher takes on the role as the reader, but then as long as those children can answer those questions, that's telling me, right, well, they have that language comprehension. There is a good chance that actually, if they were to read it independently, when they get to the point where they can read it independently, they will be able to make those connections as well.
Okay, we've got Timothy said, turning the SEEC model into a vocabulary development cycle. He's heard about it, but hasn't found a great deal of information. In your opinion, would it be worth pursuing it?
What was the name of it? Sorry?
The SEEC model.
SEEC. I'm not familiar with it, I'm afraid. So I will, I'll do my research, and Tim, I will get back to you.
Oh, I've got a question, because I found it quite interesting so there was a few things that you mentioned, and like you're saying about these, we've moved away from, well, in a lot of secondary, we've moved away now from these whole school literacy sort of things, and we do have our individual ones, which obviously is much better. But I'm sort of considering now that a lot of it seems to be focused, and rightly so, but it is, on that, understanding the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 vocabulary. And it's that, I know for me in science, it's that tier 2, which is a sticking point, real sticking point with a lot of the students. But I'm just wondering, because when you're saying that it's about 18% of 15-year-olds actually still can't really work out the codes and stuff, what are we missing in secondary that we should, I suppose, CPD wise, have more with our primary? So my training didn't cover any of this. This has all been quite enlightening for me. I'm just thinking now, do you know what? I can read the EEF stuff, but there's some massive gaps in my knowledge of what is going on at primary school. That I'm actually probably not doing with my students to help them. What should I do, Neil?
Yeah, I mean, how far do you? I mean, I think in an ideal world, and I appreciate we're not living in ideals, and especially now, secondary school teachers, there would be at least, and maybe there is, and this is me not knowing, but there'd be certainly at least one person in that secondary school who probably is taught through methods of early reading. So they know their phonics. So you have a source there that you can go to reach out and get some help with. I certainly think what secondary school teachers can do is really make sure that they understand the code. And so when your children ask you, how do you spell something, you're not giving necessarily the letter names, but you're providing them with the pure sounds of how it is that you might want to spell something. So if you wanted to spell, photo, a child asked you, how do I spell photosynthesis? You wouldn't necessarily go PHOTO. You might go, and then you might say, we don't spell that with just one F. How else can we make the sound? And then hopefully they'll make the connections there. And again, because it's photo Greek, right? Yes, Greek. You might make the association there, right? It's a Greek word. So when it's a Greek word, they tend to be spelt the f is spelled PH at the beginning. So you got f, and you got O. O is a funny one because actually it's the name, it is the sound of the letter, but normally it's just the O sound. So I think having secondary school teachers having that understanding of the English code and drip feeding that kind of phonics that way might be something that is worth pursuing and worth looking at. But certainly in an ideal world, there is someone in the school who is trained kind of to teach children how to read. Because I'm sure you have children coming from, year 7, year 8, new to the country who can't read English. And so, the best booklet in the world, isn't going to help those children read. What they're going to need is, activities like this, where they learn, first of all, a one-to-one correspondence for the letter names and for the letters and the sounds. And then they move on to a more advanced code where, because English orthography is pretty deep and complex, it means that you can have different spellings for different sounds. So I think the more that teachers know, secondary school teachers know about that, the more they can support and help. I know Phonics International, Debbie Hepplewhite, she's got loads of good resources that have the code, the written code on them. So it could be something that you print off, laminate, keep a few in, maybe not necessarily in COVID times, but in non-COVID times, you could keep a few in your classroom. And so you could hand those out to help children as well. But yeah, it's a tricky one for secondary school teachers. Yeah,
no, that's really useful, because I just sort of kind of listening to you talk, and it's just like, I feel like I've almost just jumped towards the end too much. Like we've gone through explicitly teaching the tier 2, tier 3 vocabulary, but actually there's like this big lead up to it that we seem to have forgotten about. And I think for us to just have that awareness of that is going to make all the difference, isn't it? In some sense, we're potentially just chasing our tails, trying to get to this end product if we haven't sort of put, I don't know if we haven't worked on some of the groundwork as well. I think there should be definitely a move there in secondary when you're training, that we should have this in our ITT training.
Yeah, and I appreciate, at secondary, you're a science teacher, you didn't necessarily go into the profession to teach, early reading, but the nature of the beast, as it were, means that you're going to get children in there who will need it. And I think making sure that a common criticism of phonics and all of that is that it's just far too complicated, that English as a language is far too complicated to kind of learn this way. And yes, there are always going to be exceptions and things like that, but again, the argument is, where is it, it's far easier to teach them, right, there's 26 letters, 44 sounds, and there are 176 kind of common spellings for these sounds. That's not too much to ask. I think if you can master those, I think it gets you over 90% of English becomes, it makes sense, and it's not this kind of awful mixture of bits of Latin, bits of Greek, a bit of Anglo-Saxon, bits of any other kind of country where we've kind of borrowed language from. So I think, a big thing I think for secondary school teachers is that it's a code, and it is very much teachable, and it's not, there is structure behind it. And actually, again, 44 sounds, 26 letters, 176 common spellings is all you need effectively.
Fantastic, thank you. The CEEC model was Alex Quigley closing the vocabulary gap. Like I say, I think we might have to pull his book off the shelf and have a look.
I have to dust that one off the shelf and have a look. I have read it, but not for a long old time, so I'll have to look at that again. But Tim, if you find me on Twitter, I will do my best to reach out to you and give you an answer.
And Dave has just left a message just to say that he would love to work with you on vocab and goes. So, future project. Well, thank you, Neil. I don't think there's any more questions, but thank you. I know I've got pages and pages of notes. My brain is, yeah. My team are going to love me when my team are going to love me when I go back and be like, rightio, got some more stuff for you to read. But no, thank you so much. That was so good. Yeah.
Right. I'll leave that one there. It's very weird. I'm just doing it to myself.
Yeah, in the
there's people. There are people out
in the webinar.
I don't see them.
No, so
yeah,
that's what we said. We could have had it where everybody was in if you wanted to, but yeah, like I said, it's a strange one, this, because you just sort of kind of just talking to yourself, aren't you? And you can't see anybody. So. But no, thank you so much. I'm afraid I am going to have to go. I think you have got control of this, though. So if you did want to stay, you will have the control that, in fact, if you wanted to invite people in to discuss stuff, you can do.
Okay.
But I am, somebody said we exist, we are here. Sue said thank you, Darren said thank you, Felicity said thank you. So, but yeah, I am ever so sorry. I'm going to have to run because I'm getting bombarded by 2 of my children. But thank you so much, Neil, for that.
Fine.
Thank you.
No, not a problem at all. If I'm in control, I certainly don't mind staying for another kind of 5 or 10 minutes. So if there are any pressing not that I know how to make anyone. If there's anyone who wants to come up and discuss anything, as I say, I can give you about 5 more minutes. If not, I will end the meeting now. Just let me know in the chat. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. Hopefully you all got something from that. So stop the share into the meeting. Thank you much for coming once more.